Somewhere in your wallet, your phone, or a folder you have been avoiding, there is a number that never seems to get smaller on its own. A credit card balance, a student loan, a medical bill that multiplied while you weren't looking. Modern debt does not expire. It does not take a sabbatical. It sits there accruing interest with the quiet, permanent confidence of a barnacle. Meanwhile, in several ancient societies, debt had an expiration date built directly into the calendar. Not a grace period, not a settlement plan, an actual, scheduled, society-wide wipe of the slate, sometimes every 7 years, sometimes every 50, announced in advance like a holiday nobody was allowed to skip. So, how did ancient societies cancel all debt every 50 years? The answer is not that they were more generous than we are, that money mattered less to them, or that some benevolent king simply enjoyed forgiving people out of the goodness of his heart. Debt mattered enormously in the ancient world, often violently so. The real answer is that unpaid debt was not treated as a private financial matter between two people. It was treated as a structural threat to the entire society, and structural threats, unlike individual sob stories, tend to get systematically engineered solutions. Before any government could cancel debt, it first had to invent something almost as strange. The idea that a person could legally owe another person something that did not yet exist. Debt, in its earliest form, was not physical. Nobody was handing over a bag of coins on the promise of a bigger bag later, because coins had not been invented yet. Ancient Mesopotamian temples and palaces kept meticulous records, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, of grain, silver, and livestock owed between farmers, merchants, and the state itself. A bad harvest, a family emergency, or a routine agricultural loan to cover the gap between planting and selling could leave a farmer owing more than his land could produce. And once you have a written, enforceable record of debt, you have also, almost by accident, invented something far more dangerous, a legal mechanism by which a free person could become an unfree one. Defaulting on a debt in the ancient Near East did not usually mean a phone call from a collections agency. It could mean handing over your children as servants, or eventually yourself, until the debt was worked off, a condition that historians call debt bondage, and one that had an unpleasant habit of never quite ending. It is worth sitting with what debt bondage actually looked like in practice, because the phrase can sound abstract in a way the reality never was. A farmer who borrowed grain to survive a bad season, and then faced another bad season before repaying it, did not receive a stern letter. He offered labor, his own or a family member's, as collateral, and if the debt still could not be cleared, that labor arrangement could stretch on for years, sometimes indefinitely, sometimes passed down. A daughter or son could be handed over as a pledge against a loan their parents took out, working in a creditor's household with no fixed release date beyond whenever the original debt, plus whatever had accumulated on top of it, was finally considered paid. There was rarely a single dramatic moment where a free person became an unfree one. There was a slow administrative slide, one bad harvest and one missed payment at a time, and by the time anyone noticed the pattern at the scale of an entire kingdom, a meaningful share of the free population had already crossed that line. This is where the real prerequisite problem starts, and it is a problem every early state eventually ran into. Debt bondage does not stay small. Interest compounds. Bad years happen more than once in a row. A single famine could push a meaningful share of a kingdom's free farmers into debt slavery within a generation. And those farmers were not merely unlucky individuals. They were the tax base. They were the army. An ancient king who wanted grain, soldiers, and labor for his monuments needed a large population of free, land-owning subjects who could be taxed and conscripted, not a shrinking pool of free people surrounded by a growing class of debt slaves working someone else's confiscated fields. Left unchecked, debt bondage was a slow-motion transfer of the kingdom's productive population out of the king's reach and into the hands of a small class of wealthy creditors. In other words, uncontrolled private debt did not just ruin individual families. It threatened to quietly dismantle the state's own foundation out from under it, and the people running these states noticed. The oldest known response to this problem is not a myth or a legend. It is a fragment of Sumerian administrative language. Around 2400 BC, a ruler of the city-state of Lagash named Enmetena issued what is now considered the earliest documented debt and bondage release in recorded history, using a term, amargi, that literally translates to something like return to the mother. Some historians consider it the oldest known word for freedom in any human language, and it was invented, tellingly, not to describe an abstract political ideal, but to describe the specific, practical act of canceling debts and releasing people from bondage. This detail matters. Freedom, as a documented concept, may have entered human language first as an economic reset button, rather than a philosophical one. This was not a one-time act of mercy from an unusually kind ruler. It became a recognizable pattern of governance across Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years. Babylonian kings, most famously in the era of Hammurabi and his successors, periodically issued royal edicts known as mesharum, meaning something close to setting things right or restoring justice. A new king might issue one upon taking the throne. Later kings issued them at other points during a reign, sometimes when economic pressure had clearly built up to a dangerous level. These edicts typically canceled certain categories of personal debt, especially loans taken out by ordinary people to survive hard times, released Babylonians who had fallen into debt slavery, and in some cases restored land that had been forfeited to creditors. Crucially, and this is where the story becomes less tidy, these edicts generally did not touch commercial debts between merchants conducting business. The target was not the entire economy, it was the specific, recurring crisis of ordinary people borrowing to survive, and then losing their freedom because of it. Here is where the story becomes genuinely frustrating, because the most interesting question is also the hardest one to answer with confidence. Were these edicts actually enforced across the whole kingdom, reaching every indebted farmer in every distant village? Or were they closer to royal propaganda, a dramatic public announcement that looked better carved into a stela than it played out in the muddy reality of a provincial tax office? The clay tablets that survive give us the text of these decrees with impressive clarity. They are far less clear on compliance. Some scholars point to surviving private contracts that appear to have been voided or renegotiated around the time of a mesharum edict as evidence that these resets had real teeth. Other scholars point out that powerful creditors, then as now, tend to have excellent lawyers, and an edict that a king announces is not automatically an edict that a moneylender obeys without a fight. The honest answer is that ancient Mesopotamian debt cancellation almost certainly happened, repeatedly, but exactly how thoroughly it reached the bottom of society likely varied from king to king, decade to decade, and probably village to village. The most famous version of this idea, however, comes not from Mesopotamia, but from ancient Israel, in a system known as the Jubilee. According to the biblical book of Leviticus, every 7th year was meant to be a sabbatical year in which fields lay fallow, and after 7 such cycles, the 50th year triggered something much larger. Hebrew slaves were to be freed. Ancestral land that families had been forced to sell during hard times was to be returned to its original owners, free of charge, regardless of who currently held the deed. This was not framed as charity, it was framed as a structural correction, a built-in reminder that land ultimately belonged to the community and to God rather than permanently to whichever family happened to be wealthy enough to buy it. The economic logic was blunt. Without a hard reset, land and debt bondage would accumulate in the same direction every single generation, and after a few centuries, a small number of families would own everything while everyone else worked for them under conditions uncomfortably close to permanent servitude. And this is another place where the historical record refuses to cooperate with a satisfying answer. Scholars are genuinely divided on whether the Jubilee, as described, was ever fully implemented as a regular, empire-wide 50-year event, or whether it functioned mainly as an aspirational legal and religious ideal, a line drawn in sacred text more often invoked in argument than enacted on a fixed calendar. Unlike some Mesopotamian mesharum edicts, which survive as dated, specific royal proclamations tied to particular kings and particular years, there is no comparably direct archaeological or administrative record confirming that ancient Israelite society actually redistributed land back to its original families on schedule, every half-century, like clockwork. It may have happened irregularly. It may have functioned more as a standing threat that shaped how loans were structured in the first place, since no lender wants to invest heavily in land they know might legally revert in a decade or two. Prehistory and ancient history rarely hand us a confession. They hand us a text, a law, an aspiration, and leave the compliance question maddeningly open. The Jubilee also carried a second idea worth pulling apart from the debt cancellation itself, because the two were bundled together for a reason. The same 50th year that freed debt slaves and returned land also required the land to lie completely unworked, with no planting and no harvesting, for that entire year. Read purely as agricultural policy, this looks like an early form of forced crop rotation, giving overworked soil a chance to recover after decades of continuous farming. Read alongside the debt release, it starts to look like something more deliberate, a single mechanism resetting both the ecological and the financial books at once, on the theory that land exhausted by generations of maximum extraction and a population exhausted by generations of compounding debt were really the same underlying failure, just measured in two different units. Whether the authors of Leviticus consciously understood soil depletion in anything resembling modern agronomy is a separate question the text does not answer, but the pairing itself, rest the land and free the people in the same calendar year, is difficult to read as a coincidence. What both systems shared, whether perfectly enforced or mostly aspirational, was the same underlying insight: a society that allows debt to compound indefinitely will eventually convert its free population into an unfree one, and once that happens at scale, you no longer have a debt problem. You have a different, angrier kind of society, one increasingly divided between a shrinking creditor class and an expanding class of people who have nothing left to lose. Ancient rulers were not necessarily moved by compassion when they grasped this. They were often moved by the much simpler observation that a kingdom full of enslaved former farmers makes for a lousy tax base and an even worse army, and a furious, dispossessed population makes for spectacularly bad politics. This pattern eventually reached the classical Greek world in a much better documented form. By the early 6th century BC, Athens was approaching what historians now consider a genuine social crisis. Small farmers had borrowed heavily, often against their own bodies as collateral, and a growing share of the population had fallen into debt bondage or been sold into slavery abroad to satisfy what they owed. In 594 BC, an Athenian statesman named Solon was granted sweeping legal authority specifically to fix this, and he responded with a reform remembered as the seisachthia, a Greek word meaning roughly the shaking off of burdens. Solon canceled outstanding debts secured by land or personal freedom, freed Athenians who had been enslaved for debt, in some cases arranged for the return of Athenians who had already been sold abroad, and permanently outlawed the practice of using a citizen's own body as loan collateral going forward. Unlike the Mesopotamian and Israelite systems, this was not framed as a recurring calendar event. It was a one-time structural reset paired with a permanent rule change, and not everyone loved it. Solon later wrote, somewhat defensively, that both the rich and the poor were furious with him afterward, which is usually a reasonably good sign that a reform found something close to the actual middle. He also, by his own account, refused suggestions that he simply make himself sole ruler while he had the power to do it, choosing instead to hand authority back once the reforms were in place, a detail later Athenian writers treated as almost as remarkable as the debt cancellation itself. A leader with total emergency power over an economic crisis who does not quietly keep that power, once the crisis passes, turns out to be nearly as rare in the historical record as a kingdom that successfully cancels its own debts on schedule. It is tempting to read all of this as evidence that ancient societies had cracked some secret formula for economic fairness that we have since forgotten. They had not. These systems were reactive, uneven, and frequently exempted the exact kinds of debt, commercial loans between merchants, that could have funded genuine long-term prosperity if canceled too aggressively. A mesharum edict did not redistribute wealth. It periodically stopped one specific failure mode, personal debt slavery, from permanently hardening into a caste system. The Jubilee, whether fully practiced or mostly aspirational, addressed land concentration specifically, not commerce generally, and Solon's reforms fixed a crisis that had already reached the boiling point rather than preventing one from forming in the first place. None of these were tidy, universal safety nets. They were targeted patches applied to the specific point where debt reliably broke a society, which is exactly the point where an ordinary person's bad year turned into their grandchildren's permanent condition. Modern economies solved a version of this same problem very differently, and it is worth noticing how differently. Rather than a fixed calendar reset that cancels debt for everyone at once, most legal systems today rely on bankruptcy law, a mechanism that resets debt for one person or one company at a time, on their own initiative, subject to courts, paperwork, and often a lasting mark on a credit record. It is more individualized, more legally precise, and dramatically less dramatic than a king declaring that every debt in the land is void as of this morning. But it exists for essentially the same underlying reason the mesharum edicts and the Jubilee existed. A society that allows debt to become truly inescapable eventually has to build some kind of pressure valve, or watch a meaningful share of its population get permanently sorted into people who owe and people who are owed, with no legal way back across that line. We simply moved the reset button from a public calendar to a private courtroom, and quietly agreed to pretend the two ideas have nothing in common. That resemblance has not gone entirely unnoticed. Some modern economists and historians studying Bronze Age Mesopotamia have pointed out sometimes pointedly, that contemporary economies facing widespread household debt crises are essentially staring at the same underlying failure mode that Babylonian kings addressed with a mesharum edict, just without the political mechanism to actually issue one. A modern government can bail out a bank in a weekend when the alternative is a collapsed financial system, but a broad, deliberate cancellation of ordinary household debt tends to be treated as radical, almost unthinkable, despite being one of the oldest and most repeated tools of governance on record, whether that is because modern economies are more genuinely interconnected and fragile than ancient ones, or simply because modern creditors have considerably better political representation than a Bronze Age moneylender ever did, is a question this channel is not going to resolve in the next 30 seconds, and neither, frankly, has anyone else. So, how did ancient societies cancel all debt every 50 years? Some of them, most reliably in Mesopotamia, did something close to exactly that, repeatedly, as a recognized tool of ordinary kingship. Others, like ancient Israel's Jubilee, wrote the idea into sacred law with a beautiful 50-year rhythm that historians still cannot fully confirm ran on schedule in practice. And others, like Solon's Athens, skipped the calendar entirely and simply detonated the problem once, then rewrote the rules so it could not fully reassemble. What they shared was not generosity, it was the blunt political realization that debt, left alone indefinitely, does not stay a private matter between a lender and a borrower. It quietly rewrites who is free and who is not, one bad harvest at a time. And the next time your bank sends a cheerful notification about your minimum payment due, remember that some of your ancestors lived under systems that assumed, as a basic feature of good government, that debt was supposed to eventually just stop. We inherited their crisis. We simply outsourced the reset.